Hello there, my name is Saniya Choudhry and I'm a summer intern at the Westford Museum, and I'm also with Erza, who is another summer intern at the Westford Museum. And today we will be walking through Yesterday, a collection of photographs of Westford residents modeling antique clothing at a fashion show commemorating Westford's 250th birthday celebration. And these are all based on photographs taken by Marlene Bryant back in 1979.
Mr. and Mrs. Alistair McDougall, the Minuteman costume was representative of Revolutionary War apparel. The musket pictured was carried to the Concord Bridge by Benjamin Osgood on April 19, 1775. Mrs. McDougall's velvet and chalice dress with lace sleeves was handmade by May Balch, Westford poet, artist, and teacher. Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Sambito wearing their formal attire popular in the late 1700s.
Next up, we have Mrs. Raymond Shea, who's wearing a shawl and carrying a family Bible belonging to Polly Monroe from Lexington. Polly's father was amongst the first to fall at the Battle of Lexington in the American Revolution. And then we have Mrs. Albert Picking, who is pictured in her Civil War dress, which was originally owned by Arvilla May Woodward Gould, an early Westford resident.
Katie Driscoll is pictured in a ball gown from the late 1840s. This gown is owned by Mrs. Stephen Smith. The parasol belonged to Nellie Hale Winnick, granddaughter of J.F. Fletcher, and was loaned by Dr. Andrew Cozzens.
Next we have Gary Gumachian, who is wearing an 1850 flowered silk dress owned by Mrs. Anthony Sambito. And this nice woman here is Kathy Knott, who's wearing an 1840 style afternoon dress, which was also owned by Mrs. Anthony Sambito.
Donna Tibbs is shown wearing a formal waistcoat of black velvet dating from the late 1850s. The waistcoat is owned by Mrs. Barbara Lamson.
Pictured here is Mrs. Bert Harless, who is wearing a two-piece outfit dating in the 1870s. The skirt belonged to Ellen Swallow, an 1870 graduate of Westford Academy. Miss Swallow was the first female student at MIT and went on to become MIT's first female professor. The blouse, shawl, and parasol belonged to Mrs. Harless's great-grandmother, Nancy Roby Fisk Swallow. Pictured here is Susie Weaver, who is wearing a mid-1800s ball gown carrying a fur muff. The gown was on loan from Mrs. Stephen Smith, and the muff originally belonged to Westford's Winnick family and was loaned by Dr. Andrew Cozzens.
Beth Loring in an 1896 dress and cape. The cape and dress have been in the Loring family for generations.
Here we have Kathy Knott, who is pictured in the dress that May Day wore during her graduation from Westford Academy in 1908. Miss Day was a longtime librarian at the J.B. Fletcher Library. Here we have a late 1800s swimwear. Donna Tibbs appears in a swimsuit which originally belonged to Graniteville's Stella Reed Hildreth. The costume itself belongs to Mrs. Edessa Hildreth.
Pictured is Cindy Holmes in a hand-smocked Paris silk frock dating in the 1920s. This dress belonged to Mrs. Mary Lambert. Pictured is Linda Lambert giving in her mother-in-law Mary's evening gown of the 1930s.
Next pictured is Susie Weaver in a turn-of-the-century two-piece costume. The dress and hat are owned by Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Sambito. And right after that, pictured is an 1890s organza dress, which was worn by Beth Brazeau and owned again by Mrs. Mary Lambert.
Pictured is Linda Stapleton in a two-piece touring ensemble owned by Mrs. Bowman Budinger. This ensemble is composed of a long coat and matching skirt. Kristen Bucknam is wearing an 1890s organza dress belonging to Mrs. Mary Lambert.
Now, early bridal gowns were not the traditional white of today. An example of this is the brown satin wedding gown of the 1800s, worn by Gary Germachian and owned by Mrs. Mary Lambert. Also seen is Mrs. Albert Picking's 1879 wedding suit, which was originally worn by Flora Jane Blodgett Gold.
Rose Powers wearing a 1908 bridal gown. This gown is owned by Mrs. Pat Loring.
And Beth Loring is pictured wearing a late 19th century bridesmaid gown owned by the Loring family. And our final picture for today is Rita Gagne, who is pictured in a 1940s bridal gown owned by Mrs. Lillian Baker.
Alright, that was the yesterday fashion show. Fashions from the past, photographed in 1979. Thank you for tuning in.